just like a little bit more informal and actually feel truly conversational.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, here we go. Welcome everybody to, I don't even know, this isn't even really a podcast, but I'm going to be trying on my website. You've seen some of my author interviews, and I'm going to be trying to do more of these because they're personally really fruitful for me to do some careful reading of other people's work and just engage it in conversation. So I have Dr. Karen Swallow Prior with me today. Hey, Karen.
Hey, Jen, it's been a while, maybe since my last book.
I know, seriously. This is really fun because I was actually just looking at I was looking at your list of books, your bio on your website, which I feel like I should properly read, and I will do that. But when I was looking at your first book, Booked, it was like that was 2012, and Teach Us to Want was 2014, and we were writing at hermeneutics at the same time. So it's kind of fun that here we are.
Yeah, here we are. I mean, it seems like a long time ago and like yesterday.
I know. We don't look a day older than we did in
No, no, no.
2012.
12, I know. We were babies then.
Weren't we? Well, let me read your official bio. Karen Swallow Prior is a reader, writer, and speaker. She's the author of You Have a Calling, which I probably should have done something to my camera to make sure that that actually looked right. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good, and Beautiful. She's also the author of the Evangelical Imagination, On Reading Well, Fierce Convictions, and as we mentioned, Booked, which came out in 2012. So she's been very busy. She has a monthly column for Religion News Service, and you have seen her writing everywhere. You have probably also heard her speak at a conference because she's a favorite on the lecture circuit, and just so many incredible things to talk about in your long career. And I think I would say public service too. So I'm really excited to chat with you.
Good to chat with you always, Jen.
Um, it's funny because I have my older daughter here who is 24. So I have five kids, and so 24, 22, 21, and then 18. And so I feel like calling is really like it's a perennial conversation, but I think is a very urgent conversation in our house. Like just as we talk to our kids as they're sort of moving toward, yeah, discerning what God has for them in these newly adulting years. So I was just thinking, as you were sort of taking this conversation up in your book, well, first of all, you did it for a talk. So maybe you want to chat a little bit about how you were invited to the rabbit room and just how it sort of moved from talk to book.
Yeah. The talk I was invited to give had to do with creativity. And so I did a talk
Mm,
on how we're all called to be creative. And I wanted to expand the definition and understanding of creative because I think we tend to think of it as, the creatives who do art or music or sculpture or pottery, which it includes those to be sure. But, because we're made in the image of a creator God, all human beings are called to be creative. And that can be as simple as in, how you decorate your house, how you navigate circumstances at the office with grace and creativity and interpersonal relationship. I mean, we are creating all the time. And so
mm,
that small talk turned into a bigger project on calling in general. And within creativity, of course, we are pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful, which is sort of the second half of the book.
hmm Well, so when you were delving in, like kind of expanding from creativity to a more generalized kind of conversation around calling, what were what were the books that you turned to like automatic? You're like, I actually have to like go to these three books.
Okay, so because I was drawing on, almost 3 decades of teaching college, and we go back further, even high school students, and having these kinds of conversations on this topic, I did draw from the book that was probably the most influential in my life that I was always handing out to my students, and that is a book by Jean Edward Beath,
Mm.
called God at Work. I mean, it's a classic at this point, and it's just one that I have turned to over the years in talking with anyone about calling. So that has been personally influential. And then, of course, there are actually a lot of books on calling, and I did read a lot of
I
them.
think there's room for this one.
I
I
think
really
there's
do.
room for this
I
one.
think so.
I wanted to do something different. So of course, Os Guinness has the
Mm.
classic book, The Call, I think it's called, or something like
Hmm.
that. And then Gordon Smith does some work, and there are a lot of ones that I read. There's some in the area of sociology and other kinds of academic research. And none were doing quite what I did, which I hope in terms of especially
Hmm.
the good, the true, and the beautiful, but also we are in a different moment right now. In a moment where I think the biggest sort of cultural illusion of our time in terms of vocation and calling is one that really has an impact on millennial and younger generations, but also has an impact on us because we're living in the same time. And that is the whole pursue your passion and you'll never work a day in your
Mm.
life and you'll make a lot of money. Um, and
It'll be
that
so awesome. It'll be
It'll be
amazing.
really, really awesome. And I have encountered so many people, younger people, but not so young people, who are battling despair
Mm.
and disillusionment and disappointment because that's not how it worked out for them. And so I want to say, and I'm saying in this book, that that's such an unrealistic expectation that we are bringing on unnecessary disappointment and disillusion because we don't have a healthy, good biblical understanding of work, of calling, of
Mm.
passion, and how all of those things are separate and can overlap, but often don't. And we just so that's really where I was coming from in writing this book, is drawing on this cultural moment we're in, where we have so many distorted messages because of the one or two amazing influencers out there who make so much money selling goop or whatever.
I'm curious. So, do you think it's a new conversation? Like when you compare to the conversations that you were having earlier in your teaching career to the conversations that you have now, as I'm sure people, ask you and email you and stop you as you're, just in all the different contexts that you're operating in, is the conversation significantly different?
You started out referring to the book I published in 2012, and I
Hmm.
do feel like a lot has happened in terms of expectations and the place that we exist between 2012 and now. I mean, social media was just becoming a thing, but again, and I hate to keep referring to social media, but that is the source of so many of these
Mm.
unrealistic visions of what life is going to be like and what our work life is going to be like. So on the one hand, of course, vocation and calling are, as old as human history. The particular set that subset that I come from comes from the Protestant Reformation. So we're still talking, 500 years ago, my views of vocation and calling and many of ours. And then we have sort of the modernity, which does put us in a place where we don't have to assume what our calling is going to be. It's not as though
Mm.
whatever we were born to be, whatever our parents were, that's what we're going to be, which is how it has been for most of human history. So there's that moment, and then there's this digital age moment. So age-old questions, yet
Mm.
very much having different tensions and anxieties and manifestations in particular times. And we are in that digital age, which is in that modern age, and also in a country and culture very much formed by the Protestant Reformation. So lots of things going on. And I do try to
Mm.
cover all that in my book.
You cover a lot of ground, I feel like. Just to take the social media influencer, I don't know, what do you think people are just sort of assuming about calling when they, click on to that account that
Mhm.
has gone viral and, had their viral moment and, it's somebody super young always. What do you think are the assumptions that are made?
Hmm. Yeah, so I'll answer that question by talking about my own area, which is writing, and yours as well, because that's the one where I've seen a lot of these conversations. So
Mm.
again, going back to 2012, where I got my first little meager book contract by an indie publisher, whom I love and I'm so grateful, without a social media platform, because I might have been on Facebook then. I was just starting, and it wasn't what it's become today. Becoming a published author really did depend much more on your expertise, your experience, your authority, your work, and less on social media platforms. And so now, because social media platforms is one part of platforms, the focus often is on that and not on the work and the craft itself. But the thing that social media does, and I do share a little bit of that story in my book in talking with my students, is that there's this expectation that if you write, all you have to do to be a successful and best-selling author is write something. And that means you will automatically get the publishing contract, and the publisher will automatically catapult you all on their own to bestseller status. And the reality is, I mean, I'm not a math person, but the last time I checked, I think it said there are 2 million new books published a year when you count self-published and indie publishers. 2 million. I could be wrong. Google it.
Wow.
So the numbers are against you know, anyone having the odds of being the one or two that sort of rise above the crowd and get the buyers. People are buying books, but there's
Hmm.
so many to buy that the numbers who are going to buy one particular author and one particular book are just that much lower. I mean, it's good and bad. The gatekeepers are largely gone, so the doors are open for most anyone, but that also means that the chance of being someone who rises above the crowd are significantly less. And people just, um, I know I'm taking a long time to answer your question, but in the writing space in particular, I have encountered so many beginning authors who are frustrated about getting the publishing contract, which is hard. And then even worse when they do and their book is published
Mm.
and it's a flash in the pan. And I don't mean that in a derog. I just mean this is
Yeah.
the life that we are in now. Most of what we do, it seems to be a flash in the pan. That is very disappointing to them because they seem to think that publishing a book would change their life.
Mm.
And it does not
Yeah,
for
there's
most of us.
for most of us, yeah. And I almost wonder, like the flash in the pan moment, I feel like is just gonna, if we continue to accelerate, just our experience of time and the way that we move through the world, like the moments are getting shorter and shorter. So even your
Hmm.
flash in the pan moment is getting briefer and briefer,
Yes,
because
yes,
we just move from one story to the next and one best-selling title to the next. And it's
right,
really hard I feel like, to sustain any attention for readers. And yeah.
right.
Although when you write a book about calling, there's going to be a lot of evergreen interest in that. So way to go. Way
Oh,
to
well, I hope so. Like I said, there are so many other books about calling out there, but I am trying to write in this particular moment, which also will pass. So I hope that it's a fairly evergreen book. But this is one reason why we have so many books is because part
Mhm.
of modernity is that everything is changing fast, and so it is part of our job as writers or creatives or human beings to kind of keep up and speak to the times.
Mhm. I am curious, and this was something that my daughter brought up because she was like, "You're talking to Karen Swallow Prior." Oh my gosh. I'm like, I know, it's pretty cool. And she said, ask her, I said, what would you want me to ask her? And she said, well, ask her how much her book on calling, maybe is particularly, like, her approach is particular to being a woman. And so I thought, well, let's talk about that,
Mm,
because when I was thinking about the calling books that I have read, I'm like, okay, actually none of those are by women. I mean, I've
mm,
read a lot of books on writing, I guess, the writing life. So that is sort of a particular calling book. And I would say I've definitely read a lot of those books
mm,
by women, but maybe not a general book on calling by a woman.
mm.
What do you think about that?
Wow, I am so impressed that your daughter asked that question.
I
Kudos
know.
to her. Good job, Jen, in raising the daughter. Yeah, so I very intentionally write gender neutral books.
Hmm.
That feels like part of my calling because of my academic background and my work experience has always been sort of a gender neutral calling. And so even my books are that way. Um, Yet I will, that doesn't mean I wasn't thinking about women. I was actually thinking about women a great deal in writing this book because the other target audience, besides drawing on my experience teaching with talking with college age students for a couple of decades. I also, because I speak more, and speak to audiences of writers or church audiences, which tend to have a lot of middle-aged, using that term broadly, women. I've had a lot of conversations with
Mm,
women who have perhaps stayed at home for their most of their adult lives of raising children, or maybe started school, but are kind of doing the multitasking, wearing many hats things, and who have felt that they either miss their calling or have yet to find a calling outside of the home. And again, all the anxiety and disillusionment and self-doubt. And so a lot of what I was doing in this book was writing to those women to first of all affirm that they very much have callings and are living into callings, because one of the other related
mm,
distortion is that we think that callings have to be big and glamorous and public and on a tall platform, and that's not the case at all. I mean, our family roles are callings, like to be a
mm,
husband or to be a wife or a brother or sister or son or daughter. Those are actually callings. And to be a neighbor and a citizen is a calling. And so calling isn't just connected to work, and it certainly is not connected just to paid work.
mm,
So I really very much wanted to expand our understanding of what calling is, not beyond its proper boundaries, but within its proper boundaries, which I think have become narrowed in this sort of
mm.
workaholic, celebrity addicted culture. So in that sense, I'm very much writing to women and for women. And in fact, I'll tell a little, you know, writing secret
Ooh.
about the process of this book is actually going through the final edits. I realized, because I do intentionally write, gender neutral, I hope, books. I realized that I felt like I didn't have enough examples and stories of young men
Mm,
that would speak to them. So I went back through and added a couple of anecdotes that I thought might speak to younger men who are specifically who are struggling, because I had kind of really been thinking especially about the, middle to older aged women. So,
mm. I mean, that's such a challenge in writing a book, is trying to think broadly about the reader, which some publishers are like, they don't want you to think broadly, but I think for a book on calling, obviously,
right.
if you're not thinking, it is a broad topic and it can apply to a lot of people. I definitely feel like you're a middle-aged woman. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll
I'm a
say
little older than middle aged for myself,
well,
but
I'm 51, and my last children are going to be seniors in high school. I have twins that are going to be seniors, but I'm definitely seeing a lot of friends in that sort of liminal space of, okay, I'm transitioning out of one particular calling, and the all that goes with a calling, right? There's a certain kind of schedule and routine and context and even community, and I'm going to move away from that and I'm going to transition into what. And so I think it
Mhm.
really begs the question, I think I'd love to hear you talk about, is like, how do I know my calling? Like, where is it
Mhm.
going to come from? Am
Mhm.
I going to apply for a job and then it's going to be offered to me? And so that's going to be my calling? Or do I sit at home and, wait for somebody to call me? Or do I counsel with my pastor? What do I do? And, that could be that could be the 22-year-old graduating from college. That can be the 50-year-old, graduating into a new season of life. It could be the retiree, right? Anytime when you're in a transitional time, I think that's an urgent question. Okay, so what now? And how do I know what will be
Yeah,
next?
no, that's an excellent question, and my quick answer is all of the above, or any of the above would work. But I do, one of the major points I make in the book is that calling does come from outside
Yeah.
ourselves. It's not the same thing as, our desire or passion or feeling or, the thing we want to do. It does come from outside. And so we do have to discern and listen. And that also means we have to put ourselves out there and we have to try things, right? We have to sort of be open. And of course, this is especially true of younger folks who are in that age of going to school and figuring out what they like and what they're good at. But sometimes we have to do that at the other end of life
Mm,
as well. And so I think it means first of all, recognizing that there is no one calling. We have multiple callings over the course of our lives. Again, we have the family relationships that I talked about before. We have, maybe we have ministry work that we do on the side, or we have full-time jobs. All of those, and sometimes full-time jobs, I say in the book, that's not necessarily a calling. Sometimes we have a job because we have to eat, and that doesn't feel like our calling. And sometimes our jobs support our actual
Hmm.
calling. And that's wonderful too. That's probably the case for most people. And so, sort of holding multiple things openly in our open hands at once is part of the answer. It's recognizing we don't have just one calling, we have
Hmm.
multiple callings. The callings can change form over time, and some callings can actually end. I mean, they can call, so if you lose a
Hmm.
job that is you feel is your calling, that could mean the end of a calling. It could also mean sort of the transformation of a calling. I know in the process of writing this book, I was, kind of already on the way to writing it, when my own academic career upended and ended unexpectedly. And so I've that an academic vocation ended in one respect, but it also changed forms. I'm still at heart, I'm a teacher, so I
Hmm.
still teach through what I write and teach through speaking, and I have other guest teaching opportunities. And so I would say that calling transformed, and for a moment it looked almost unrecognizable and seemed like it was
Hmm.
over, but it's taken a different shape. But sometimes, if you are married and your spouse dies, then that means your calling as a spouse has ended. So this does happen.
Hmm.
And so I think just recognizing that the calls can change. We certainly want to put energy into discovering and discerning the call so that we can hear it when it comes, but also realize that when those calls end or don't come, that's also kind of a push in other directions so that we can, if our calling isn't this, we have to find out that it might be this other thing over there that we weren't even aware of.
Hmm. You mentioned, I mean, I did want to chat about like just kind of your academic vocation. When that came to an end for you, did you, I mean, I guess I want to kind of hear you tell a little bit more of the story of like just the internal process of do
Mm,
I keep knocking on doors? Do
hmm.
I pursue it in another avenue? How do I know that
Right.
that calling has ended?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I didn't put all of this in the book just because I was and still am in process. And even was less into the process when this I was writing this book and it was finished. But actually, the answer to that question does illustrate the multiple callings that we have. So,
Hmm.
for example, so I left my academic career or vocation at age 58, which in this particular culture and time, especially in academia, is not a good time to get hired anywhere. It just, most academic institutions want to hire younger professors, they cost less. And then you add that with the fact that many institutions are going to close because of the enrollment cliff and the population
Hmm.
decline of college age students. So just my age made it unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely to get a call. And then my age made me not want to start all over again. And then I also have a calling as a spouse to a husband who has his job.
Hmm.
I have a parent, a remaining surviving parent. I actually walked with my mother through her death last year, which was a calling, and she lives here with
Hmm.
us along with my surviving father. So uprooting them or now him to move somewhere is to me is you know my, my calling to be with my family here in this time and place supersedes my calling, my
Hmm.
academic calling at this time. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this in passing in the book, but this is really, really true for me, and I'll probably write about it more in future days, but it's just very deep and profound to me. I feel very, very called to this place where we live. We have lived in this
Mhm.
old house and in this little community for 26 years now. So we have roots, but also in the past couple of years, as I've been home more, working from home, the connections and roots that I have in this community have deepened and grown even more. And that, I believe, is a calling.
Mm,
And so that's part, so you can see I have multiple callings. And so these callings can be sort of in competition or in tension with one another, but they can also help us to make those decisions when they come along. So my decision to not go back onto the marketplace, the academic
mm,
marketplace looking for a position, those are all the reasons why, and they all have to do with other callings that I have.
mm. Which reminds me of like later in the book, how you really hit the theme of wisdom, which has just been like this little pet interest of mine, how we have lost kind of a category for wisdom. We don't understand what wisdom is. And
Mhm.
I feel like you're describing a process in which, you know, the discernment that wisdom can afford can help us to kind of navigate different callings and different seasons of our lives. So, can you just say a little bit about wisdom, you know,
Mm.
and as it's related to discovering and discerning our calling?
Mhm. I love that question. I was just doing some reading yesterday for a totally different subject about Tolstoy and
Of course, of
yeah,
course.
of course. And the book by Gary Saul Morson, who's a famous Tolstoy professor, well, Russian literature professor, was talking about how the difference between the rationalist approach to ethics and the classical Aristotelian approach to ethics.
Mm,
And of course, ethics really is all around the good life, like finding the good life, which requires wisdom. And so the point that he was making is that the rationalist approach to ethics think everything can be understood and applied in a mathematical sense. And so whatever is true in one situation is always true in another. Aristotle and those that follow him have a place for wisdom, which means that there are principles, many virtues that one seeks, but the way they are going to be applied in any given time, context, situation, relating to certain personalities and people will look different, and that requires wisdom. That's what's required, and that's what a completely rationalist and empirical approach to
mm.
ethics does not make room for. And going back to on Reading Well, the book I published in 2018 on finding the good life through great books, and long before that, the more reading I do, the more I realize I am an Aristotelian at heart. So, Aristotle makes room for wisdom because virtue
Mm,
is a moderation between extremes, and so it's going to be different. What's virtuous is always going to be different depending on what the context is that that pulls us toward extremes. And that's not the same thing as relativistic ethics at all. Just
hmm
to throw that out there. But wisdom is so the right choice for me, the right decision for me wouldn't necessarily be the right decision for someone else. When we're
hmm
talking, again in the book, I draw on a classic book by Gary Friesen with the unassuming title called Decision Making and the Will of God, where he basically said that was transformative for me when I read it, 25 years ago. He says, there is no perfect blueprint for your life. God's moral will is revealed in the Bible, and it's all there. So all of the other, as long as we're abiding by that, all of the other decisions that come along, like should I take job A or take job B? Should I marry this person or that person? All of them, as long as they're not transgressing the already revealed word of God, all of them
mm,
can be fine. The better one or the best one just requires wisdom. It requires
mm,
wisdom to choose between jobs and cars and lots of things. But we're not crossing God's moral will by taking this job rather than that job. We just have to have the wisdom to know what's going to, as much as we can, what's going to be best for us. And I'm
mm,
trying to make those decisions within the context of callings.
mm, hmm I just have to put a plug in for the one of, I think it's the most recent issue that Comment published on discernment.
Mm.
And you're a research fellow at Comment, so I feel like I
Right,
can
right.
talk
Yeah, I
about
know.
that. But
It's in my email box, but I don't think I've read that one yet. So don't
you
tell.
know what? I think it's really relevant to this
Mm,
conversation. And Robert Joustra has
mm,
an article at the end. He's a Canadian scholar at Redeemer University, and I've just had a chance to meet him since I was in Toronto for a long time. But he talks about prudence and, as another
mm.
way to talk about wisdom and just how not every virtue is a virtue in every context.
Right.
That the wrong, of virtue in a particular time transposed to another
Yep.
time in another context might actually become a vice. And I just
Exactly.
think we don't really think about that. And so I want to turn a little bit to thinking how you have this, this theme of virtue, that true calling is oriented toward the true and the good and the beautiful. And so I'll have to just tell you a little speech that I've been giving to my adult children, well, all of my children. And yeah, it's a wonderful in the car speech. And so just feel free to borrow it for any
All
other,
right.
people that are asking.
I'll envision being in the car with you.
That's right. But I think it was honestly in First Chronicles. Like it was just this random verse. I was going to look it up for the interview, and it doesn't really matter. It was the New Living Translation, so I'm sure it's a little bit free and paraphrased. But this idea that certain people were called to a task, and they were trusted, and they were capable. And I've been telling my kids, I'm like, this is really, I mean, even before reading your book, just thinking about when you move into your adult years, what are you building? You're building skills, on the one side, you're building capacities and capabilities. And on the other hand, like you're also building character, and you
Mhm.
can't have one without the other. If you have all the skills in the world and not the character to support it, then well, we know where that goes because we see that all the time. But if you also have care, I mean, you could be the most loving and wonderful and just and generous person, but if you aren't making, good tables, right? To
Mhm.
speak to Dorothy Sayers' quote, then you're not actually inhabiting your call. Like you're not doing
Mhm.
work.
Mhm.
If you're not doing good work, you're not doing God's work, right?
Right.
And I just felt like you were. So now is where I just want you to riff on why you chose to really think about. I mean, I feel like you do talk about the skill, but I also want you to talk about the character. I kind of actually want you to
Mhm.
talk about both and feel free to illuminate on true, good, and beautiful. And I can also add lots
Yeah.
more questions.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good segue into that. But yeah, I will, one of the researchers I draw on who in the book who's not a Christian as far as I know and just does, does research in I think it's computer science is his field or something as Cal Newport. And he's sort of the
Hmm.
go-to on work. He's written a lot on work, deep work, and lots of other books on work. And so in one of his books, and I don't remember which one right at the moment, but he talks about the craftsman mindset versus the passion mindset. And so the passion mindset is one, is that, oh, I'm passionate about this thing, so I'm going to pursue that. His research actually shows that passion follows competence, that actually you become passionate about what you're good at. And so
Mm,
what you become good at requires skill and attentiveness and time in the task. And that the better you get at something and the longer you stay, the more passionate you get about that. And so those things that he's talking about that cultivate competence and skill in a task also are the things that cultivate character,
mm,
patience, diligence, longevity, and I'm certainly never arguing that someone stay in an abusive or toxic place that's bad for you or anything like that. But we as a culture have kind of lost track of how much
mm,
value is brought just by staying in a place for
mm,
a while and the consistency that comes from, again, we could be talking about a workplace, but lots of other things as well. And so the craftsman mindset is about the work and doing good work, the way that Dorothy Sayers talks about, and that I quote in the book, but also you can't separate that from the kind of character that comes from developing the ability. And so when I transition in the book to the seemingly abstract and ethereal notion of the transcendentals, the true, good, and beautiful. And they are that, but I really try to use these sort of universal, transcendental ideas and make them
Hmm.
practical for thinking about our work. And so, when I talk about the true, we have the capital T truth, which is good. I love capital T truth, but we also have truth that's translated best as kind of like reality. So, like, we
Mm,
might have these big ideas about what it'll be like if I pursue this passion and follow this work, but we have to actually know what the work is like and what's
mm,
required in the process. And we talked about that earlier about like just because you write something doesn't mean you're going to get a publisher and they will make it a bestseller. Like there's a lot of process involved that's not fun and very heartbreaking and humiliating and hard. So we need to know the reality of the work, and we also have to know the reality of ourselves. Like you said, you could be a wonderful, kind, good person and just not be a good artist.
mm,
Right? But you might be good at something else. And so we have to know that the truth or the reality about those things in order to do the good work. And I kind of culminate in the chapter on beauty, the lots of things that's my favorite chapter, and hopefully I
mm,
bring it all together. But one of the things that I say about beauty, drawing on Roger Scruton and his book Beauty, is he talks about how beauty is, and I'm using my words, I don't know that they're his words, is kind of an interplay between subjectivity and objectivity. So in classical aesthetics, we'll talk about the beauty very objectively, like the qualities of the art piece. And that's really how I tend to talk about beauty in art and literature. But there's a subjective element too, and he talks about it as fittedness. And
mhm,
so, if we're talking, so for example, if you have a house of a certain architectural style, the way you would decorate it would be you'd want it to be fitted to that style. If you have a certain personality, you want to find a calling, hopefully, that fits your personality and friendships that fit your personality. And so the things that fit well require sort of the fittedness between the thing and yourself. And that can be a lifelong quest. That's really what younger people, especially, are really trying to find how they fit in. But all of us are trying to find out how our skills and our abilities and our
mm,
passions, all the things fit, not into the world of 200 years ago, not the world of 100 years from now, but in the world right now where we are. That we have to find our fit. And that is an element of beauty. When things fit well,
mm,
it's actually beautiful.
mm. It speaks to the idea that you have to be living in community to discover your calling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We can have these pie in the sky ideas rooted in ideals and abstracts about what we'd like to do and how we'd like it to be. But unless, I think back to that old, I don't even know if they teach this anymore, but I remember being a freshman in college and taking a Psychology 101 and learning about the Johari window, those four quadrants, like the things we know about ourselves, the things other people know that we don't know, and so forth. I can't remember all the quadrants, but there are things that we don't know about ourselves that
Hmm.
we can't see or recognize in ourselves, both good and bad. But it's the community, our friends, our church, our mentors, our colleagues that can call them out and say, hey, you're really good at this, or maybe you ought to try something else.
Mm,
Right? We can't, they can help us understand because they have a larger context. We may not recognize that we're really good at something because it's just natural to us. But when someone else can point it out and say, you're really good at this, you should lean into that. And then we also have to be diligent to kind of understand what we're not good at. I tell the story in the book of beginning to take piano lessons when I was 5 years old. I fancied myself to be a piano player, and it was many years later, probably at least ten years later, of 10 years of piano lessons when
oh wow.
I was actually sitting waiting for my lesson, and I could hear the girl playing who was before me, and she was a year older than me.
Mm.
Um, but I listened to her and I said, I don't play like that. I'm like, I am not a good pianist. And so I realized I'm not good at this. I'm going to not waste anyone's time and money anymore, my parents' money. And I'm not going to take piano anymore. I've been trying for however long it was, 10, almost 10 years, I think, at that point. So let me find something that I'm good at. But nobody told me that. Um,
Mm,
you know, and so certainly not the piano teachers who are paid to keep giving those lessons every week. But once I figured it out, then I did other things, and so that's a failure of community in that
mm,
example. I mean, it's not a devastating one. I mean, how were they to know that
hmm
I wanted to do something I was good at? And so, sometimes we have to
hmm
go out of our way, to hear the hard things or to do the
hmm
hard discernment. And so, but that again, that can help us to find what we are good at and what we might actually be called to.
hmm Well, I actually wrote that down as a quote, like it's on us to go
Mm,
and seek the feedback from other
yes.
people, which is hard to do. And I think there's a tension that's sort of begged here because if you don't give yourself enough time, I mean, you didn't decide after 3 weeks of piano lessons that piano wasn't for you. Like that was 10 years, you
Mhm.
gave it a fair shot. So there's on one hand, you have to give it enough time,
Mhm. Right.
because obviously skills aren't developed overnight. But then, you also have to sort of, yeah, ask for feedback. And I think that's a challenge as a parent. Is I can think of our older daughter who, when she was applying to university, wanted to do clarinet performance, and she's an amazing clarinetist. But to be like a clarinetist in a symphony orchestra, like is like the cream of the crop, it's the Olympian of the Olympians kind of thing. And I remember my husband and I sort of really struggling with that question of do we do the practical thing? I mean, you actually talked about that in your book, it's okay not to be practical, but at what point
Right.
is it, are you sort of tasked with saying to somebody, hey, go for it, and we're cheering you on, and you may want to consider what are the practicalities and the obstacles. How would you advise teachers and coaches and parents who are guiding young people into the discernment of their
Mhm.
skills and their callings?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, and in the college example, it's a sort of an easy answer. We have to look at what we're sacrificing
Yeah.
in order to do that thing. And sometimes the sacrifice isn't, it's not a big sacrifice. And so we have the freedom to pursue that and to try it out. In the example of the sort of the in the book, it's the 4-year college degree. If you're getting a 4-year college degree, it really doesn't matter that much what you major in. Now, there may be some technical, if you're going to be a nurse, you probably need to major in nursing, but even med schools and law schools often want English majors, so shout out to the English majors. So,
Woo!
yeah, it's not as cut and dried as we might think. But what I don't want people to sacrifice, and maybe this is saying it a little bit too late because it's already, we're having a collapse in higher education and the economy because of this. But we don't
Mm,
want people to go into $100,000 worth of debt when they're only going to get a job at Starbucks when they get out because so many people have gotten a college degree that there's no more demand for them. Again, it's the math
yes.
that I'm not good at, but we've
Yeah.
got to face the math. And so someone who is I don't want people to sacrifice the $100,000 and a lifetime of debt for any major. But if you're there and you can major, that's an opportunity to pursue what you love and maybe what's practical.
Mhm.
And so the same is true of any interest. Like as long as you're not sacrificing something that is more important, another calling, and this is true not only of college students, but I would say a spouse or a daughter, an adult daughter or son. If you can't sacrifice your family for your career. We've seen what happens,
Hmm
for generations when that has happened, and that's not the kind of proportion to invoke another quality of beauty that I talk about in the book. That's not the kind of proportion that leads us to truth, goodness, and beauty.
hmm Yeah. Proportionality, by the way, was one of the things that stuck out to me in that chapter. I'm like, oh, what a great, like, this is just a word to kind of name the
Hmm.
reality of different seasons have different callings, and you may have a calling to write, but when you're in the season of writing a book, like it sort of takes over your life. And then
Mm.
but you know that you're not going to live like that forever,
Right,
which, I
right.
mean, speaking from
Hopefully.
recent experience, right?
Yes.
I know. Well, book release too, right?
Yeah,
Give yourself
yeah.
the next 3 months to be crazy. I want to kind of do a lightning round with some words that I think
Sure.
we've been talking about, but I just think, just to clarify for people, calling and passion, what's the relationship?
Yeah. So calling comes from outside, passion comes from inside. They can, for a blessed few, overlap for a blessed time, but sometimes they don't, or probably more often they don't always. So the passion is what drives us from inside, that we desire, which can be cultivated, and calling comes from outside. And sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't. And our job is to, as much as we can, to make them overlap when they can, but to also understand that they don't always.
Hmm. Calling and work.
Mm. Well, we always have to work. Even, we have to work, to wash the dishes. We have to work to do this or that. That's not always our calling. Sometimes there are tasks and responsibilities that are part of life or might be part of our calling, but work is always there, and hopefully the work supports the calling or the finding and fulfilling of our calling.
Calling and skill.
Hmm. Skill is a big part of calling. I do not like, and I mentioned in the book, that trite saying that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called.
I love
That's
that you push back on this.
that is not a good way to live life, because nobody wants an incompetent anything. And so we are responsible as good stewards and good human beings to cultivate skills in the work that we are doing. And if we are thinking about calling, we should, it doesn't always happen this way, but we really should, consider the skills we have. Now, I'll just I know this is lightning round, but for example, I am not a person who would be good with any kind of healthcare or nurturing of any kind, except for my dogs. But I was called to care for my mother during her
Hmm.
illness and dying, and I did it to the best of my ability, and it was a calling that I had. And so I learned things. I learned how to be caring and nurturing, even though those weren't my natural skills, because God called me to be that and do that, for a
Hmm.
season in my life. And so
Hmm.
skills are not always there. Sometimes we are called to things we are not skilled at or passionate about or want to do. But that's exactly why they don't overlap all the time, and we need to recognize that.
Hmm. I also think I know we're on a lightning round, but we're not. But just to kind of put a pin in the conversation around the writing life, I think that the more writers give themselves to opportunities to develop skills,
Mm.
um, the better off you're going to be,
The
right?
more
And
likely they are to be called,
the
right?
more likely they are to be called and to have other opportunities. And it's just
Yeah.
been kind of a rule of like my writing life is like I move towards opportunities where I feel like I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow. And
Hmm.
it feels like it's served me well.
That's the craftsman mindset,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
What about calling an opportunity?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, opportunity can be very serendipitous or providential. I believe that heartily, but I also believe that, we can create opportunities. We have to put ourselves out there, and so it's really a dance, between our effort and just kind of what the universe gives us. And It's a
Mhm.
combination, and sometimes lightning strikes and sometimes it doesn't. But we need to be ready, um, when the opportunity comes.
Mhm. I'm always very at admiring, I think, of people who just take risk in pursuing opportunities because I think that can be really challenging and it's so
Mm,
vulnerable.
mm,
And you can't make an opportunity come to you, but you can take the
mm,
risk of pursuing one. Feels relevant. Okay, here's a lightning round as related to, I think, some of the various callings that you talked about in your book, and you've mentioned some of them already. What would you say are things you've learned in the calling of marriage?
mm. Yeah, I would say, I mean, wow, that's a good question.
I
I've been
know.
married for 40 years and I'm so unprepared for this question.
It's like just stick with it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, this is a whole other book, but my husband and I were such different people when we met and married because we were so young, and that was
Mm,
40 years ago. And yet, I think our calling has always been to grow together and learn together and to actually a friend of mine said this to me some years ago, and who was looking at our marriage and saying the thing that she learned from it is how we didn't try to make one another, we didn't try to make each other into people that we weren't.
mm,
And so, like, the calling is to the marriage and to being together, but also to being ourselves within the marriage. And because we are called to be our own people as well, and called to the things
mm,
that all the things that we talked about here. And so, but I definitely believe I was called to this man in this marriage and early on, and thank God that it was early on because it doesn't seem
mm.
any easier these days for young people
Yes.
who want to be married, and we live in a culture that does not make that easy these days.
Hmm. Or desirable,
Right, right,
rather
right.
than,
So many
um,
obstacles.
absolutely. Yeah, related to staying your own person, I remember my mentor in college was like, if you do the unity candle, don't you blow those candles out. You take the two candles that represent
Oh,
the the
yeah.
the people, the
Oh,
husband and
right.
the wife, and you can light the third candle, but don't blow the other one out. And she
Oh, I
was
love that.
very firm
That's
about that. So
good
so
job,
we
mentor.
took her, I know, we took her advice. What about calling as related what would you say about your calling to placemaking? I mean, you've talked about being called to this place and making this
Mhm.
home and in
Mhm.
this community.
Yeah, so I think that again, this would be a good example of where what's wise and good for me isn't necessarily for the next person. So I think this is where my personality and preferences come in. I'm a person, I do not like change at all, so that plays into it. And when you mentioned earlier about taking risk, I'm not a risk taker. People think I am. I'm not a risk taker. And most
Mm,
opportunities sort of have come to me without me looking for them. I just try to do good work and be faithful in that way. And so I think that
mhm,
there are many factors, but we could take the fact that I don't like change, and so I like everything to be the same, and so that helps me to hear the calling to be here in this community, to make the most of it, and to do the things that make me feel rooted and connected here. So that's yeah, and I also have, I'm a highly sensitive person with HSP. There, you can look that up. But also, actually, traveling makes me anxious and ill. Even though I'm not an anxious person, I'm getting better at it. But just my love
mhm,
of home is actually kind of also rooted in the anxiety I feel when I'm away from home, and so
mm,
it makes me want to to love and appreciate being here more. And those are things specific to my personality and my character. I am challenged and stretched in a number of ways, but it still is I feel like the way I've been made and the way I've been formed over the years, and so it is what it is, and so I lean into it.
mhm. What about calling as related to writing?
Hmm. So that's a good, so yes, must talk about that.
I know. We know people will want to talk.
Yeah, yeah. So on all my bios are different forms I've taken over the years, but the consistent thing is I always call myself a reader first and a writer second because I've always
Mm,
been a reader first. I love reading, I love words, I love language. I've studied three languages. So I love imbibing words and language, and that has formed me. And so I have become a writer, but that wasn't what came first, and it also doesn't come easily, actually. I do a lot of writing now. It does get a little bit easier in the same way I think, any kind of physical exercise gets easier after years of practice and training. But it's not something, there are many writers I can look out and say, I will never write like that. I wish I could write like that. And so
mm,
I have to work hard at the writing that I do, and the ability that I've gained. And so I think that
Mm.
I have been called to do it. And I also pursued my academic vocation long before I became a writer. And that kind of gave me the platform to be a writer, to get the calls, the literal calls or emails from people to write. And so most of the opportunities have come without my looking for them, at least
Mm.
initially.
I think it's so going to be really encouraging for people to just hear, like, it's hard. I think people imagine if you have a calling to the writing life, then that must mean that you're always, working with the flow,
Just
flow
writing with
every day.
my little quill pen.
If anybody has a quill pen, it's Karen Swallow Prior, I feel like.
Nope, total laptop, ThinkPad.
Well, last question. We've talked a lot about what calling is, what it isn't, different callings that you've had in your life. I would just love for you to end the conversation to talk about a really consequential yes, you said, that either confirmed a calling or led you in the direction of a calling. You could share, a story from the book or another one, and a consequential no.
Oh, wow. Good questions. Okay. So, a consequential no is a recent one and related to all this. And so I want to word this delicately, but when I left my academic, I don't know why, but I should totally pull an Anne Lamott.
If they were, right, you
Yeah,
could
yeah,
only tell the
you
stories
could,
that
yeah,
that they've merited.
yeah. But so basically, I could have kept my last academic appointment if I had agreed to be silent on social media, basically. I mean, so basically, and not that I care about social media that much, but that's where my voice
Mm,
is carried. And so I mean, that was a very traumatic and difficult and hard and awful decision and position I was in. And because I didn't want to give up my academic vocation, but for the reasons I mentioned
mm,
earlier, I knew that I would not be, looking for another position. And so I said no to that offer. And left that calling because I also feel called to my greatest spiritual gift. They're kind of like tied besides teaching is prophecy.
mm.
And so I did not want to give up my calling to be a prophetic voice, such as it is, which I don't think it's that devastating, but to some people, I guess it is. So that was a very consequential no, but
Yeah.
I do want to
Mhm.
say that the Lord has been good and kind, and my other callings have supported that no, and given me, other ones or callings taking a different form. A consequential yes, there are lots. I mean, there are lots of yeses. Um, I would just, I mean, we've already mentioned it, but I'll just say a consequential yes was getting married to my husband 40 years ago.
Mm,
When that wasn't even and I do write about this a little in the book, that isn't even really what I had planned for my life. I mean, I had a timeline and all of those things and thought I knew how everything would turn out because I'm a planner that way. I've since become less of one. I just like to go with the flow. Because the flow's
mm,
kind of carved out, I guess, at this point by
mm,
my own, the things that I've done and continue to do. So that was a consequential yes, and I highly recommend marriage to the
mm.
right person. So yeah,
Hmm. Wonderful answers. Well, Karen, I'm going to just show your book, even though I know it's going to be backwards. You have a calling, finding your vocation in the true, good, and beautiful. Thank you so much for chatting about it today.
thank you.